June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. Rain fell steadily outside, mixing with the dull hum of a diesel generator. Inside a makeshift wooden hut, an unfinished checkers board sat next to a Pacific map covered in pencil lines and red circles marking targets. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the P-38 Satan's Angels, looked up when the screen door rattled. A thin man in civilian clothes stood there, his face angular, his expression calm. Charles Lindbergh. The name froze the room for a moment. The man who had flown across the Atlantic alone, now standing in a crude outpost in the jungles of New Guinea, asking to discuss how the P-38 was being flown in combat. No one inside that hut knew that this brief interruption would stretch the reach of the P-38 by hundreds of miles, changing the way America fought the air war over the Pacific. And it would all begin with one deceptively simple question: how much fuel are you burning per hour? When a civilian stepped into the center of an air war. June 1944. On the strategic maps inside 5th Air Force headquarters, the Southwest Pacific looked less like a geographic region and more like a ladder of targets stretching from the shores of New Guinea to the Bismarck Archipelago and onward toward the Philippines. For the United States, there was one unspoken rule that governed every movement. Every mile forward was purchased with aircraft fuel. And nothing in this theater was more precious, more unforgiving than fuel in the air. From Guadalcanal to Bougainville, from the Admiralties to the Vogelkop Peninsula, the air war in this region was not simply a contest of firepower. It was a contest of endurance, fought between pilots in the cold, merciless numbers ticking downward on their fuel gauges. Every time a lightning formation pushed deeper into enemy territory, the smallest change in weather, wind, or evasive maneuvering could push them beyond endurance. Some never returned. In this theater, errors were punished not by bullets, but by the ocean. New Guinea was the worst of all. It was a realm of towering walls of tropical storms, fractured terrain, razor-edge mountain ridges, violent downdrafts, and endless black jungle. Below the clouds, there was no place to land, only treetops sharpened like spears. Beyond the coastline lay an ocean that swallowed aircraft without a trace. And yet it was here, where aviation fuel meant life or death, that a man with no uniform and no military rank walked into the heart of a war that should never have involved him. 5th Air Force possessed the longest-range fighter in the Pacific, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. But even the Lightning was bound by limits that every pilot understood intimately. Dozens of targets remained just at or beyond its combat radius. Every escort mission ended the same way. P-38s were forced to peel away early, leaving B-25s and B-24s to fend for themselves in the final 20 to 30 minutes, the period when Japanese fighters attacked most fiercely. The Americans commanded the skies, but they did not command time. And fuel was time. The Japanese, meanwhile, were losing their air power, but what they still possessed, dense anti-aircraft networks, hidden dispersal fields, rugged terrain, made every extra minute in hostile airspace a gamble. In this precarious balance, a man walked into Hollandia Air Base wearing a soft civilian cap, a collared shirt, and the calm posture of someone checking conditions before a test flight, not someone entering a combat zone. Yet his arrival would change the P-38's role in the war. It would push the Lightning hundreds of miles beyond what its pilots believed possible. And it would do so because he carried with him an understanding no one else in the theater possessed. To understand why Charles Lindbergh's ideas struck 5th Air Force like a shockwave, one must examine the strategic picture of the Southwest Pacific in mid-1944. From 1943 to 1944, General Douglas MacArthur's campaign followed a simple doctrine: bypass the strongholds, cut off the weak links, leap forward. But leaps required wings that could span the distance. The Pacific was not Europe. There were no friendly airfields scattered every 80 miles. In this theater, 200 miles was a significant strike. 300 miles was an undertaking. 400 could be suicidal. P-40S lacked the range. P-47S drank fuel too quickly. Only the P-38, sleek, twin-engine, long-legged, could attempt the deep missions. The Lightning became the backbone of long-range sweeps, intercepts, escort missions, and armed reconnaissance. But even with 2 engines and an array of tanks, it still could not reach many critical Japanese positions without returning on fumes, or not returning at all. Far more P-38s were lost to fuel exhaustion than to Japanese gunfire. On April 11, 1944, 3 P-38s went down in the ocean after a storm forced them off their planned route. The pilots were not defeated by Zeros. They were defeated by the sky itself. This was the reality into which a stranger walked, someone who introduced himself calmly at the doorway of a commander's hut. Charles Lindbergh. And for a moment, time seemed to stop. Charles August Lindbergh was 42. For a fighter pilot, that was ancient. For a civilian, even stranger. But he carried something far more valuable than youth or rank, a lifetime of taming long-range flight. In 1927, he flew a single-engine aircraft across 3,600 miles of open ocean, an achievement every aviator at Hollandia had grown up hearing about. During that flight, he mastered something no military manual had ever taught: how to squeeze every possible minute out of a gallon of fuel. Yet politics kept him off the battlefield. Before the war, his outspoken opposition to American intervention in Europe made him an enemy of President Roosevelt. When Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the conflict, Lindbergh tried to return to military service. Roosevelt personally ensured he would not. But the war demanded skill more than ideology, and 5th Air Force needed exactly what Lindbergh had. Manufacturers and senior officers quietly maneuvered him into the Pacific as a technical civilian observer. A vague title, a perfect loophole. He could inspect operations. He could advise pilots. He could even fly, if someone unofficially allowed it. When he stepped into Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald's recreation hut, Lindbergh did not stand as the lone eagle. He stood as a man holding a key to a problem no one had solved, and the P-38 pilots of the Southwest Pacific had no idea how much they needed that key. Long-range missions were nightmares disguised as routine orders. To strike Morotai, Biak, Noam 4, and Wewak, P-38s needed to fly hundreds of miles over empty ocean, through unpredictable tropical weather, past towering cloud formations, into flak zones, often dogfighting, then flying home through weather that had changed entirely, all while managing fuel at the edge of catastrophe. Every pilot knew the same sensation: the fuel gauge dropping faster than expected, the horizon still empty, and the stomach-churning fear that they would run out before the coastline appeared. P-38 pilots feared nothing more than fuel starvation. A dogfight could be survived, an engine failure could be managed. But running out of fuel over the sea, that was a death sentence. So when Lindbergh flew with the 475th Fighter Group and returned with dramatically more fuel than anyone else, it was not curiosity that filled the camp. It was disbelief, then suspicion, then, slowly, hope. Because if his results were real, the entire war in this theater could change. Every P-38 pilot was trained on the same doctrine: avoid running over square, never allow manifold pressure to exceed RPM. Doing so risks detonation and catastrophic engine failure. This was not a suggestion, it was a law. But to Lindbergh, it was merely a conservative guideline. He did not view engines as temperamental beasts. He viewed them as equations of pressure, temperature, mixture, and power output. Where pilots trusted instinct, Lindbergh trusted data. Where pilots feared damaging their engines, Lindbergh saw extended efficiency zones hidden beneath the official charts. So he did what no combat pilot dared do. He reduced the Allison engines to 1,600 RPM, then increased manifold pressure to balance power output. Pilots reacted the only way they knew how. "You'll blow the engines." Lindbergh answered calmly, "I already tried. The engines didn't blow." It was the first crack in a belief system built over years of training. The recreation hut of the 475th Fighter Group was a crude building: palm thatch roof, dirt floor, one ping-pong table, a few decks of cards, a dim light bulb. Yet it became the unlikely birthplace of one of the most significant operational innovations in the Pacific Air War. Here Lindbergh gave his first presentation to the men who ruled the skies over New Guinea, aces with double-digit victories, hardened by years of combat. And he told them something none had dared imagine. "Your aircraft can fly 400 miles farther. Not with new tanks, not with upgraded engines, but with a technique no manual had ever mentioned. The shock in the room did not come from disagreement. It came from the realization that no one had ever questioned the old rules. McGuire, future second highest scoring American ace, watched from the front row, arms folded, eyes sharp, skeptical, but unable to ignore the evidence. MacDonald, commander of the 475th, understood something different. If Lindbergh was right, the strategic landscape changed instantly, and MacDonald was not a man to ignore possibility. Pilots began testing the method. At first, only around the airfield, quick loops in case the engines faltered. At 1,600 RPM, the Allisons sounded alien. Lower, slower, resonant, almost as if the engines were laboring under strain. Many pilots felt an instinctive fear, as if the aircraft were moments away from a mechanical failure. But the gauges told a different story. Oil pressure, normal. Temperature, steady. Cylinder head temperatures, cooler. No signs of detonation. When they extended these test flights into full missions, the results stunned the entire unit. Pilots who normally landed with nearly empty tanks now landed with 20 gallons, 40 gallons, sometimes 80. But Lindbergh? He landed with over 200 gallons remaining. The numbers were undeniable. And for fighter pilots who survived by minutes and miles, these numbers meant life. The revolution had begun. Summer 1944, MacArthur's advance depended on pushing air power deep across island chains. Every new leap required fighters with reach, not just to strike, but to escort, to protect, to control airspace. Lindbergh's technique expanded possibilities: deeper bomber escorts, longer fighter sweeps. Neutralization of outlying Japanese bases drastically reduced fuel-related losses. But its greatest impact was time. Extended range accelerated the entire New Guinea campaign. Suddenly, airfields once considered out of reach fell into P-38 range. Islands once requiring capture for forward bases could now be bypassed. Japanese supply lines collapsed faster. MacArthur's return to the Philippines, originally projected for late 1945, began in October 1944. The war did not pivot on a single technique, but it accelerated because of one. After his initial briefing, Lindbergh did not ask pilots to trust him. He chose the only method fighter pilots respected. He flew. He flew with MacDonald, with McGuire, with Merrill Smith, through storms, through flak, through long missions and short ones, and he stayed welded in formation as if he'd flown the P-38 his entire life. An American ace later said, "He flew the Lightning like he was born in it." Within days, doubts evaporated. Within weeks, Lindbergh was not a visitor. He was a teammate. MacDonald later wrote, "I stopped seeing him as a civilian. He was a combat pilot." The United States Army Air Forces were rigid, hierarchical, methodical. Engine procedures were decided by engineers and training boards, not by a civilian parachuting into combat. But the Pacific was a theater of improvisation, dictated by weather, distance, and necessity. Here, rules bent before reality, and Lindbergh's data was reality. By July 1944, pilots across the theater were whispering, "Try the Lindbergh lean. Use the long-range setting. You can stretch another 100 miles." Pilots share what keeps them alive, fast. The technique spread not by orders, but by trust. Reducing RPM, increasing manifold pressure, switching to autolean, holding a steady indicated airspeed. Simple steps, profound effect. Lindbergh's method produced approximately 70 gallons per hour consumption, up to 400 added miles of range, missions lasting 8 to 9 hours. These were not improvements. They were transformations. And all of it, every ripple across the Pacific campaign, began with a man stepping quietly into a hut, interrupting a checkers match. No fanfare, no orders, no rank. Just one question: how much fuel are you burning? No one knew then that this moment marked the beginning of a shift that would shape every major P-38 operation that followed. Every deep escort, every long sweep, every high-risk penetration into Japanese territory. Lindbergh, the man barred from wearing an American uniform, became the instructor of the finest fighter pilots in the Pacific. And in the weeks to come, his techniques would save lives expand horizons, and alter the course of the air war over New Guinea forever. When doubt evaporated and a revolution in the air began. Morning, June 27, 1944. New Guinea had been raining since first light. A thin veil of mist lay over the reddish dirt runway at Hollandia, muting the faint glow of the airfield lights. For the P-38 pilots of the 475 fighter group, this was just another day. Bad weather, long mission, familiar targets. For Charles Lindbergh, it was something else entirely. This was the day he stepped into combat beside the men whose fate he intended to change or die with. 12 years earlier, he had flown the Spirit of St. Louis across a cold ocean, alone, with 450 gallons of fuel and no modern navigation aids. Today, he was about to enter a different kind of flight, a true combat sortie with danger coming from flak hidden in the jungle, Japanese aircraft lurking in the clouds, and the constant threat of death inside tropical thunderstorms. No one was certain he would survive. Some believed he wouldn't keep up with formation. Others thought he would become a liability they would have to protect. Most said nothing. They simply wanted to see what would happen when a 42-year-old civilian met real war. 10:30 a.m. The rain had eased. The Allison V-1710 engines began to cough and roar to life, their dry, hard rhythm echoing across the valley. For the P-38 pilots, that sound was the only familiar thing in a world of uncertainty. McDonald led the formation. McGuire flew as his number 2, Smith flew number 4. Lindbergh, who had only 80 minutes of checkout time in the P-38, took the Blue 3 position on the wing of McGuire, an ace with 15 kills. "Think he'll pull it off?" one crew chief asked as the formation advanced the throttles. Another shrugged. "Who knows, but he looks damn good on takeoff." Lindbergh's Lightning rolled forward, twin booms vibrating as the engines came up to power. No one said a word, but every eye on the ground followed his airplane more than any other. As the formation rotated and lifted clear of the dirt strip, McDonald glanced left. Lindbergh was there, locked in at perfect spacing, just a few yards off McGuire's wing, holding position without sliding, without hunting, without wandering. For a man new to the P-38, that was a clear sign. He didn't just understand the theory. He could feel the airplane like part of his own body. In war, real aces recognize that detail instantly. The moment they left Hollandia's coastline, the P-38s ran into a wall of gray cloud. New Guinea always seemed to change moods in hours. Mist in the morning, blistering heat at noon, thunderstorms by afternoon. Today the cloud deck was thick and low. Holding formation inside it would be difficult. For a pilot not fully familiar with the Lightning, it was a serious test. McDonald and McGuire checked their wings repeatedly. Lindbergh stayed welded in place, flying as if he had years in type. The engines were set at standard cruise, 2,200 RPM, mixture on automatic. This was how every P-38 pilot had been taught to fly. It was doctrine, it was safe, it was trusted. Only Lindbergh did not believe in that setting. He had already proven to himself that the engines could be run far more efficiently. But today, on this first combat mission with the 475th, he followed their procedure. He would not experiment while others were depending on him. That was what set him apart. Lindbergh was not a gambler. He was an engineer with nerves of a combat pilot. Now, as they flew through the New Guinea cloud, where a single mistake could send two lightnings colliding, he offered the one thing that mattered most: absolute predictability. And that, more than any reputation, was what made the aces glance at each other with a new kind of respect. The old man can fly, they thought. The day's target was not some grand air battle. The order was simple: hunt down and destroy a Japanese barge in Kibos Bay. To a 1944 American fighter pilot, that sounded routine. But nothing in New Guinea was routine. The bay was narrow, pressed against the shoreline. Behind it, the jungle rose in a dark wall. The Japanese used those trees as camouflage for their anti-aircraft guns. Every barge was a trap. Every low-level strafing run meant flying into a web of invisible guns pointed upward. When the formation dropped to attack altitude, the Japanese gunners woke up. Green, red, and orange flashes burst out of the tree line. Tracers and black puffs of flak climbed toward the lightnings. Lindbergh saw them, but he didn't key the mic. He had seen combat before with Corsair squadrons. But this was the first time he flew through flak in a P-38 with his own life on the line. McGuire led the first diving run. McDonald swung wide to cover. Smith swept the right flank. Lindbergh eased the nose down, held his line, stabilized his firing pass. Tracers slashed across the water. When his turn came, he squeezed the trigger. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon turned the surface of the bay into a line of white splashes in flame. The barge erupted in fire and smoke. The formation pulled off target, Japanese guns still clawing at the sky. But what mattered most that day was not the burning wreck in the bay. It was what happened when they got home. Back on the ground, crew chiefs swarmed the aircraft, inspecting for flak damage, checking engine temperatures, looking for stress signs. The pilots climbed down, stiff from hours in their cramped cockpits. Lindbergh stepped off the wing, removing his helmet with the same calm expression he'd had before takeoff. Minutes later, a crew chief headed toward McDonald, his face tight with disbelief. "Sir, you know how much fuel Mr. Lindbergh has left?" McDonald answered without interest. "How much?" "Twice as much as the others." McDonald stopped. McGuire overheard. The other aces turned and looked toward Lindbergh's Lightning. This was not luck. This was not one strange flight. Lindbergh had done something up there none of them had been taught. Something that broke every habit they'd built from training, manuals, and survival. For the first time, curiosity began to erode skepticism. Over the next 5 days, Lindbergh flew repeatedly with the 475th Fighter Group. On July 1st, during a 6.5-hour mission, he landed with 210 gallons still in his tanks. Many of the unit's best pilots came back with their needles hovering near empty. On July 3rd, during a B-25 escort mission, 2 pilots had to break formation and head home early. Fuel levels were too low to safely continue. Lindbergh did not turn back. He still had comfortable reserves. Crew chiefs began writing down the numbers. The trend was unmistakable. Flight after flight, mission after mission, Lindbergh was landing with 40 to 60% more fuel than anyone else. At a time when 30 gallons could mean the difference between ditching at sea and reaching the coastline, Lindbergh was saving over 100. This was no longer a curiosity. It was a fundamentally different way of flying the Lightning. And everyone in the unit knew, if these numbers held, the way they fought the war would change. Evening, July 5th, 1944. The group's recreation hut, dirt floor, palm frond roof, a single hanging light bulb, became the setting for a meeting no one would forget. Every pilot in the 475th was there. McDonald stepped forward. "You've all seen it," he said. "He's doing something we aren't. Tonight, he's going to explain it." Lindbergh walked to the front, holding a small notebook. He didn't sound like a warrior. He didn't sound like a commander. He sounded like what he really was, a technical mind. He talked about the relationship between manifold pressure and RPM, the efficiency curve of an engine, the balance point between minimum fuel flow and usable thrust, the nature of Audouin mixture, the internal behavior of the Allison V1710 at different power settings. Younger pilots stared, unsure whether to follow or tune out. They were used to flying, not lectures. Then Lindbergh said the numbers. 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, Audouin, 185 miles per hour. The room went silent. A pilot objected. "That's over square. Run it like that and the engines will blow." Lindbergh answered calmly, "They don't. I've flown it that way many times. The engines run cooler. The RPM is steadier, and fuel consumption drops sharply." No one argued after that. They all understood the implications. If he was right, their entire concept of the Lightning's range was wrong. McDonald authorized tests. Not adoption, tests. The first pilots to try Lindbergh's technique were visibly tense. When they rolled back the throttles and dropped the engines to 1,600 RPM, the sound changed. The Allisons didn't sing, they rumbled. To men trained to equate high RPM with safety, it felt like inviting failure. But then the gauges spoke, cylinder head temperatures dropped. Oil pressure stayed in limits. Fuel consumption fell dramatically. True airspeed remained acceptable. After 30 minutes, they landed. The crew chiefs measured remaining fuel. The results were undeniable. The next day, 5 more pilots tried, then 7, then McGuire himself, then McDonald. Within a week, almost the entire 475th had tested Lindbergh's method. The internal report was blunt. His technique works. It extends the lightning's effective radius by approximately 30 to 35%. July 10th, the group flew a mission lasting 7 hours and 20 minutes. This time, the entire formation used Lindbergh's settings. When they returned, the crew chiefs checked their tanks. Each P-38 had 80 to 120 gallons remaining. Before this, a similar mission would have ended with pilots sweating over nearly dry tanks or ditching in the ocean. Now, those extra gallons meant more time over the target, more freedom to pursue enemy aircraft, more room to maneuver around flak, more margin to survive storms or headwinds on the way home. Most importantly, they could now strike targets that had previously been written off as beyond reach. This was the true turning point. A technique that began as one man's personal experiment had grown into an operational advantage. Once the data was compiled, word spread fast. P-38 units near Hollandia began asking questions. Pilots from the 8th Fighter Group wanted details. The 35th Fighter Group requested specifics. Soon, 5th Air Force Headquarters was receiving quiet reports. Crew's fuel efficiency greatly improved. Engine reliability unaffected. Range increased beyond prior estimates. The reason was simple. Pilots were coming home with more fuel, and in the Pacific, survival was the most convincing proof there was. In a theater where many runways were nothing but bulldozed dirt and fuel was stored in drums under palm trees, a technique that saved fuel was not a curiosity. It was a weapon. Lindbergh had given them that weapon, without firing a single shot. McGuire, once skeptical, wrote in his journal, "He flies well, extremely well, and what he says is true." McDonald recorded, "He doesn't just talk, he demonstrates." Younger pilots put it more simply, "His technique keeps us alive." From that point on, Lindbergh was no longer the 42-year-old civilian. He was part of the squadron, rankless but respected. They called him by a simple, understated title, Mr. Lindbergh. To understand how decisive this turning point was, one must look at the El Paputi Bay mission on July 28th. There, Lindbergh did more than save fuel. He shot down a Japanese aircraft in his first real air-to-air engagement. It was one of the rare times in modern war that a civilian downed an enemy combat aircraft. The battle lasted nearly 30 minutes. Captain Saburo Shimada, an experienced Japanese pilot, used every trick he knew to evade repeated P-38 attacks. He turned hard, used his lower speed to outcircle the faster Lightnings, and refused to present an easy shot. But Lindbergh stayed patient. He studied the flow of the engagement. He waited for the head-on moment. When Shimada turned directly toward him, Lindbergh put his sights on the engine and fired a long, steady burst. The concentrated fire of 4.50s and a 20mm cannon tore into the Sonya's nose, slowing the propeller. The aircraft began to die in front of him. The Sonya went into a steep, smoking dive and did not rise again. Everyone in the formation knew who had fired the decisive burst. They knew it was Lindbergh's kill. No one recorded it officially, but none of them forgot it. The turning point was no longer theoretical. It was written in fire and wreckage on the surface of the sea. After that mission, attitudes shifted even further. No one in the 475th questioned Lindbergh again. One ace remarked, "If he weren't a civilian, he'd be in command." Lindbergh never asked for that. He came as an observer, but he had become something very different. The man who changed how the United States flew its premier long-range fighter in the Pacific. Wars do not always pivot on dramatic invasions or massive bombing raids. Sometimes they turn on a small technical insight, on someone willing to challenge an old rule, and someone else willing to let him prove it. Lindbergh was that someone. By late July, internal USAAF documents began to adjust. Lower RPM cruise settings, higher manifold pressure at moderate power, leaner mixtures, new cruise efficiency charts. The real turning point was not in a single mission. It was in those revisions. By October 1944, Lindbergh's method had effectively been absorbed into the official P-38 operating procedures. For perhaps the first time in United States air power history, a frontline engine management technique came from a man with no rank, no formal position in the chain of command, no official authority, just results. Once the Lightning could safely fly 400 miles farther, Japanese planners lost confidence in their assumptions about Allied range. Bases once thought untouchable came under attack. B-25 and B-24 escort coverage improved dramatically. Armed reconnaissance could push deeper into areas that had never seen American fighters. The timetable for the advance toward the Philippines accelerated. Historians would later note, Lindbergh helped MacArthur move perhaps 2 months faster than expected. 2 months in a world war is not a minor detail. It is the difference between isolated garrisons holding out or collapsing, convoys escaping or being intercepted, defenders rallying or breaking. The turning point that began in a dusty hut at Hollandia rippled outward across the entire theater. Above the clouds of New Guinea, where the war is fought not on maps, but on fuel gauges and heartbeats. New Guinea was unlike any other battlefield of the Second World War. In Europe, pilots could navigate by towns, rivers, rail lines, and roads. On the Eastern Front, they could follow great plains and mountain chains. In the Southwest Pacific, a pilot looked down and saw only one thing, a deep, endless green. Rainforest smothered everything. It swallowed ridges, valleys, and villages under a single dark canopy that seemed to move like a living organism. Beneath that canopy were things no pilot wanted to meet. Ravines, swamps, waterfalls hidden in mist, rivers carving black wounds through the jungle. Above it all, clouds rose in towering white walls tens of thousands of feet high. Inside those clouds lived thunderstorms. Inside those storms lived lightning. And between all of it flew P-38 pilots. Their world had no safe options, no emergency fields, no alternate airstrips, no easy way out. And in that world, Lindbergh helped drag the P-38 into territory no American fighter pilot thought possible. 8- and 9-hour missions in a single-seat fighter. To understand how brutal those missions were, one has to step inside the hell they endured. Hell not created by the Japanese, but by the Pacific itself and the mechanical limits of the P-38. To a modern viewer, a fighter looks sleek, fast, almost elegant. To a Pacific pilot in 1944, the P-38 was a vibrating metal cage, a hard seat, a life raft packed under it, fuel tanks behind the pilot's back, a control panel crammed in front of his face, the entire airframe buzzing as the engines dropped to 1,600 RPM. The pilot wore a thick flight suit, harness straps biting into shoulders and hips, a helmet, headphones, an oxygen mask tightened across his face. None of it could be removed. No one dared relax. They flew for hours without standing, without stretching, without shifting beyond a few inches. A 475th pilot would later say, "Your body starts hurting at 30 minutes. At 60 minutes, you get used to it. At 120, you start wondering if you're losing your mind." And that was just the opening phase of the mission. What made New Guinea a form of airborne hell was not the enemy, it was the weather. To reach their targets, pilots had to push through. Cloud walls rising above 20,000 feet. Winds that shifted direction and strength without warning. Tropical storms that materialized out of nowhere. Lightning that hunted in packs. Air currents that hurled aircraft up and then dropped them. They still had to hold formation through all of it. Drift 20 or 30 meters, and a pilot could vanish into cloud, dragging his wingman with him. The most frightening thing about Pacific Cloud wasn't turbulence, it was disorientation. Inside a solid white world, there was no horizon, no ground, no reference. The instruments became the only truth. 1 second of doubt, a glance outside, a moment of vertigo, and a pilot could roll into a bank he didn't feel, diving without knowing it. One ace from the 431st Squadron later said, "You don't really fight the Japanese in those clouds. You fight the airplane, and you fight your own senses." Lindbergh understood something clearly. An 8-hour mission was not just a technical challenge, it was a psychological one. When Lindbergh proposed running the engines at 1,600 RPM, many pilots thought he was crazy. Not because they couldn't follow the math, but because they'd heard what low RPM sounded like over long stretches of ocean. At 1,600 RPM, the P-38's Allisons changed character. The vibration deepened. The sound became low and compressed. The engine beat like a slowing heart. The airframe shook in long, heavy pulses that reached the control column. Even an ace like McGuire admitted his first impression. It felt like the engines were dying on us, and that one small mistake away, they'd just blow apart. Lindbergh saw it differently. Temperatures were dropping, oil pressure remained steady. Fuel consumption moved into an optimal band. The mixture burned lean and efficient. The pilot's psychology, though, was simple. When the engines sounded wrong, their bodies reacted. They knew too well, if something happened to the engines, the jungle or the sea would finish the job. In war, there are two kinds of danger. The kind that shoots at you, and the kind that waits for you to make a mistake. Over New Guinea, the second killed more men. A P-38 had two engines. That did not always mean safety. At low altitude, losing one engine could twist the aircraft so violently that it rolled and hit the ground within seconds. One mechanic put it bluntly, "The P-38 has two engines. If one dies, you pray the other isn't too strong." Below was jungle with no clearings. Farther out was ocean. Beyond that, Japanese-held territory. When a Lightning flew 300 or 400 miles into enemy airspace, everyone on board knew no one was coming to rescue them in time. So when Lindbergh showed them that each pilot could save an extra 100 to 150 gallons, it wasn't just a tactical gain. It was a chance to live. The mission on July 1st, 1944, became one of the clearest real-world tests of Lindbergh's method. The formation lifted off at 6 a.m., cloud base low, winds strong, cruising at 10,000 to 12,000 feet. Their target, Japanese staging points around Gilvink Bay. As they approached the area, weather cut across their planned route home. A thick band of storms formed directly over their return path. If they tried to punch through, the formation could fragment. Radios could fail, and aircraft could collide. McDonald chose to swing the formation down along the western coastline, adding more than 40 minutes to the flight. To the pilots it was the long way home through the killing zone. To Lindbergh it was a chance to prove his method in the harshest way possible. On the way back, multiple pilots radioed fuel critical. Later, crew chiefs confirmed some aircraft landed with 3 to 6 gallons in their tanks. One Lightning nearly ran dry, taxiing in. Lindbergh, he landed with 210 gallons remaining. The number sounded absurd, but it was real. No one in the group could deny it anymore. This wasn't just effective. It was necessary. Imagine you are 22 years old. You left home less than a year ago. Now you sit in a P-38 cockpit, flying continuously for 7 hours, unable to stretch your legs, barely able to turn your neck, breathing through an oxygen mask that never comes off, never able to relax because the mission demands full alertness. After 3 hours, muscle pain sets in. After 4, your back throbs. After 5, dehydration gives you a pounding headache. After 6, many pilots began to feel their hands shake from low blood sugar and exhaustion. And none of this includes combat yet. The worst part is mental. The last 2 hours of a mission are when fear becomes the most aggressive enemy. Fear of running out of fuel. Fear of storm fronts blocking the route. Fear of losing the formation in cloud. Fear of ditching in the ocean. Fear of one lone zero appearing at exactly the wrong moment. In that stretched, brittle state, pilots still had to make life and death decisions in fractions of a second. That is why Lindbergh's technique was more than a fuel trick. It eased the psychological load. It gave pilots a fuel gauge that no longer hovered constantly on the edge of disaster. Each extra gallon meant another minute alive. Another minute alive meant another chance to make it home. During the escort mission for 16 B-25s striking Jeffman Island, the Lightnings completed the bombing run and then split into elements to hunt Japanese shipping. 2 pilots came on the radio. Low fuel, returning to base. For them, the mission ended right there. If they stayed, they might not get back. Lindbergh heard the calls. He did not turn back. His gauges still gave him room to fight. He stayed with the hunting element, calm enough that McGuire finally asked over the radio, "How much fuel do you have, Lindy?" Lindbergh's answer was simple: enough. Back at base, the comparisons were brutal. Lindbergh was saving more fuel than the most experienced aces. At that point, no one could pretend this was a fluke. On July 7th, the group flew a mission into the Bismarck Sea. On the return leg, they hit a wall of storm so thick it might as well have been solid metal. Radar reports from ground stations were blunt. That cloud mass could destroy a formation that tried to punch through. MacDonald had to decide immediately. Go through the storm, risk losing aircraft and pilots. Swing out over the water, burn more fuel, climb toward the mountains, vanish into cloud and risk collisions. McGuire's voice cut in. We're not getting through that, Smith added. We won't have the fuel if we swing too wide. Then Lindbergh spoke quietly. We have the fuel. Not just him, all of them, because they'd flown the whole mission using his settings. MacDonald made his choice. The formation turned and took the longer way, skirting around the storm. 25 extra minutes in the air. When they finally broke out into clear weather, many pilots exhaled in relief. Under old cruise procedures, those 25 minutes simply wouldn't exist. The tanks would have been too close to empty. This time, every Lightning made it home. No one said much about it afterward. They didn't have to. Everyone understood. Without the new technique, they likely would have lost 2 or 3 aircraft that day. July 28, 1944. Blue flight was ordered into the El Paputi Bay area. Bad weather, limited visibility, altitude around 8,000 feet. On the way back, radar reported 2 Japanese aircraft moving along a converging course. They were Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya light bombers. On paper, the Sonya was unimpressive. Slow, lightly built, modestly armed. In the hands of an experienced pilot like Captain Saburo Shimada, it became something else entirely, especially when the American pilots chasing it were exhausted after 6 hours in the air. Shimada used the clouds, turning hard, rolling unexpectedly, forcing P-38s to overshoot. For almost 30 minutes, Blue Flight chased him and his wingman without scoring a clean kill. Then came the head-on moment. Lindbergh lined up opposite Shimada. Shimada did not break away. He flew straight at the P-38. It was the kind of attack bordering on suicide, but it could throw an opponent off just enough. Lindbergh held his nerve. He fired a 6-second burst. 20-millimeter shells and .50 caliber rounds hammered into the Sonya's engine. The propeller slowed visibly. The aircraft staggered. A moment later, it rolled off and headed earthward. Shimada's plane dove into the sea and did not rise. It was the only shot Lindbergh ever fired in anger during the entire war, and it was deadly accurate. No official record credited him, but every pilot in the formation knew exactly who had brought the Sonya down. They didn't need paperwork to remember. 3 days later, on August 1st, death nearly collected the debt. On a mission to the Palaus, an A6M0 slipped into a firing position behind Lindbergh's P-38. He had been in the air nearly 7 hours. His body was drained. His reactions dulled. McGuire saw the danger and shouted over the radio, "Brake right! Brake right!" Lindbergh hauled the stick over. G-forces slammed into his body, crushing his chest, weighing down his arms. The Zero flashed past, missing by feet. McGuire rolled in, firing to drive the attacker off. When they landed, no one made speeches. There were no dramatic confrontations. Lindbergh simply sat down, removed his gloves, and for a moment his hands trembled. He had come within seconds of dying in a sky he had helped tame. At 5th Air Force headquarters, the conclusion formed quickly. It was time to send him home. He had proven what needed to be proven. If he died now, it would be a political storm and a personal tragedy. The Pacific had taken enough pilots. It would not take this one, at least not on their watch. The true hell of the air war was not always in the dogfight. It was flying 8 hours at 10,000 feet, sweating inside a flight suit you could not remove, feeling your spine scream against a rigid seat, seeing an unbroken wall of cloud in front of you, hearing flak fire from places you could not see, listening to your engines vibrate and wondering how long they would hold, watching the fuel gauge and not knowing if it would be enough. Inside all of that, Lindbergh's technique, dry, technical, unemotional, became a lifeline. Not because it made the P-38 more glamorous, not because it turned pilots into supermen. It gave them time, hope, options. An extra 100 gallons of fuel was not just a number. It was the right to choose, the right to go around the storm instead of through it, the right to pursue or disengage, the right to turn back late and still make it, the right to live. No one fights well while silently counting down to fuel starvation. Lindbergh took that constant dread and pushed it back, just far enough that pilots could focus on the enemy and on staying alive. And that, more than any single dogfight or bomb run, changed the way the war was fought. When the teacher leaves the front and the legacy stays in the sky. In August 1944, Hollandia Air Base no longer looked like the place Charles Lindbergh had stepped into 6 weeks earlier. The red dust strip was still there. The Allison engines still thundered in the jungle valley. But one thing had changed completely. The P-38 pilots who had once doubted him were now flying with his technique as standard practice. 7- and 8-hour missions, once considered the extreme edge of endurance, had become routine. Targets that had been labeled impossible now appeared weekly on the operations board. Pilots who had once stared at fuel gauges in quiet panic now carried extra minutes, sometimes extra hours, of fuel into combat. Yet just as Lindbergh's technique began to shape operations at the strategic level, a decision from far above the jungle ended it abruptly. He was to leave New Guinea. On the morning of August 5, 1944, a message came down to 5th Air Force. It was short and precise. Lindbergh is to return immediately. Reason: political risk if killed in action. General George Kenney, commanding of 5th Air Force, understood there was no room to argue. He had allowed Lindbergh to fly P-38 missions as a technical observer, knowing full well that this stretched the limits of regulations. Kenney had once said, "I need good pilots, not clean political files." Washington did not share that view. In the Capitol, they saw another picture. If Lindbergh, pre-war national icon, symbol of American aviation, died in combat as a civilian, it would explode into a national scandal. They could not accept that risk. Kenney had to do what he did not want to do: end Lindbergh's time at the front. No one in the 475th Fighter Group welcomed the decision. Even the men who had once resented him felt the loss. Lindbergh wrote in his journal, "I do not want to leave the Pacific, partly because the work is not finished, partly because I want to keep fighting as a real combat pilot." He knew there was still room to refine his methods. He wanted to test them further. He wanted to fly more long-range missions with the 475 to push the P-38 deeper into its undiscovered envelope. But orders from Washington were absolute. Kenney told MacDonald. MacDonald told Lindbergh. Lindbergh paused for a few seconds and simply said, "I understand." No protests, no bargaining. That was his style. He spoke little. He acted. From August 6th to August 10th, Lindbergh was still allowed to fly, but only on lower-risk sorties. The 475th wanted him to have good farewell missions. They put him in formations led by McGuire. They placed him on MacDonald's wing for reconnaissance flights. They let him choose altitudes and routes so he could feel the P-38 one last time. On these flights, almost no one talked more than necessary. Up in the sky, pilots communicated through formation. Tight, precise, flawless. That was the most sincere salute they could give. Rumor spread quietly through the group. Lindbergh will be gone in a few days. No one said they were unhappy about it out loud. They didn't have to. The 475th had grown used to having him there. August 12th, 1944. Soft sunlight over the strip. Thin clouds drifting across the Cyclops Mountains. The 475th Fighter Group gathered near the runway, not in a formal formation, but in the way combat pilots always seem to assemble, some leaning against wing-leading edges, some sitting on fuel drums, some standing with arms folded, silent. There were no speeches, no band, no official ceremony, just men who had flown through storms together, looking at one another and understanding what could not be said. MacDonald stepped forward and shook Lindbergh's hand. "You came here as an observer. You leave as one of us?" Lindbergh smiled faintly and dipped his head. McGuire pulled him into a brief embrace and said, "If you'd stayed longer, you might have ended up an ace." The group laughed quietly, a small, tired laugh that could not hide the regret. When the C-47 carrying Lindbergh lifted off from Hollandia, more than a few pilots watched until it shrank to a silver speck in the sky. One ace would later recall, "Nobody said it in that moment, but we all felt we'd lost something important." The strange thing was this. Right after Lindbergh left New Guinea, his technique spread faster than ever. Within 2 months, the 35th Fighter Group was using it. The 8th Fighter Group was using it. P-38 units from Biak to Num 4 were flying the new cruise. 5th Air Force began folding it into official guidance. Nobody wrote Lindbergh technique on the blackboard. They called it the new way to cruise, long-range cruise, the lean 1,600 method. But everyone knew exactly where it came from. With an extra 400 miles of reach, the P-38s gave planners something priceless. They no longer had to capture as many islands just to get new airfields. That translated into 3 major shifts. 1, skipping strong Japanese bases in the Bismarck chain. Targets once considered safe behind distance were suddenly vulnerable. Island garrisons that had expected immunity found P-38s arriving overhead with enough fuel to fight and leave. 2, far more effective escort for B-25s and B-24s. No more fighter cover peeling away early and abandoning bombers. 3, accelerated timetable for the Philippines campaign. MacArthur could move faster. He could hit deeper without waiting for closer strips to be built. One staff officer would later write, "The increased radius effectively shortened the New Guinea campaign by nearly 2 months." 5th Air Force Summary, 1945. 2 months in wartime is not an abstraction. It is the difference between thousands of men alive and thousands of men dead. On the maps drawn after 1945, P-38 flight lines appear as long arcs, reaching over waters and islands that had once been beyond reach. Those arcs did not come from engine redesign. They did not come from new fuel tanks. They came from a small change in procedure, invented by a civilian who had once been barred from wearing an American uniform. By late 1944, the USAAF issued revised documents titled Revised Cruise Performance, P-38J/L. They included reduced power settings, manifold pressure around 30 inches, 1,600 RPM auto-lean mixture, optimized indicated airspeed. Nowhere in those pages did the name Lindbergh appear. No credit, no origin note. But every P-38 pilot knew. That chart had one author, whether the manual admitted it or not. Years later in an interview, a former pilot from the 433rd Squadron said, "We didn't put his name in the official reports, but every mission we flew after 44 carried his fingerprints." That was the most honest kind of acknowledgement. In the 1960s and 1970s, when many P-38 pilots were in their 50s and 60s, reporters began asking about Lindbergh's time in the Pacific. McGuire, the second-ranking American ace, had died during the war, but McDonald and several other P-38 men were still alive. They didn't talk about celebrity. They talked about skill. They said, well, Lindbergh was a good pilot, not because he was famous, because he understood the airplane better than any of us. He wasn't arrogant. He didn't lecture. He flew first, talked later. He saved lives directly by flying with us, indirectly by changing how we flew. One of them summed it up in a single line. His technique made the war shorter. For years, the public image of Lindbergh in the war was vague. Many assumed he just observed a few flights. The reality was very different. He flew roughly 50 combat sorties, about 25 of them in P-38s with the 475th. He saw combat directly at least half a dozen times. He shot down one Japanese aircraft, never officially credited. He was nearly shot down by a Zero once. He led formations on multiple missions. He consistently returned with the best fuel reserves in the group. That is not an observer's record. That is the record of a combat pilot, one denied a rank, but not the reality of the work. Lindbergh fought as a soldier in a war that refused to let him be a soldier. When he returned to the United States, Lindbergh did not launch a publicity campaign. For the rest of his life, he mentioned New Guinea only in his journals, a handful of letters. His book, The Wartime Journals of Charles A. Lindbergh, 1970. No boasting, no demand for recognition, No bitterness about the lack of official credit. That quiet restraint only deepened the respect felt by the men of the 475. One ace put it plainly, he didn't need a medal, he just needed to be right. On August 26, 1974, Charles Lindbergh died on Maui from lymphoma. He was buried in a small graveyard in a simple handmade coffin with about 15 people present. There was no grand military funeral, no gun salute, no major Pentagon ceremony, but at reunions of the 475th Fighter Group, his name came up often. Not as the transatlantic hero, not as the controversial pre-war figure, as a fellow pilot. They remembered it the way he flew on McGuire's wing in bad weather, the day he shot down Shimada's Sonya, the time he argued to take the long route around a storm, and was right. The way he taught them the most important lesson, the airplane can go farther than the book says. One veteran wrote, "To the rest of the world, he was a symbol. To us, he was a pilot, and he kept a lot of pilots alive." In the end, Lindbergh's story is not just about a range extension trick. It is about what happens when someone dares to question the limits. Why 2,200 RPM? Why autoric? Why not low-power cruise? Why accept the manual as the final word? Why assume the P-38 had already been pushed as far as it could go? Lindbergh did not rebel against the system for its own sake. He approached it like a scientist. He did not break rules. He showed that some of them were incomplete. The Pacific Air War was decided not only by major battles. It was shaped by hundreds of thousands of sorties where each gallon of fuel was a minute of life. Each minute of life was a chance. Each chance could tilt the balance of a campaign. Lindbergh did not just teach pilots how to fly. He taught them to understand the machine they were trusting with their lives. In a world where many men died because of things they did not know, knowledge itself became a weapon. Conclusion. The legacy does not belong to headquarters. It belongs to the men who flew. On his last day at Hollandia, there was no formal send-off, but in 6 weeks he had changed how the P-38 was flown, added roughly 400 miles to its practical radius, helped speed up MacArthur's campaign, reduced pilot losses from fuel starvation and weather, demonstrated the power of careful engineering in the middle of a brutal war, left behind a technique that became standard for P-38 squadrons across the Pacific. He never received formal combat credit for these things, but he was recorded where it matters most in the memories of men who flew, fought, and came home because of what he taught. That kind of respect cannot be bought with fame. It cannot be manufactured by propaganda. It is earned when a man stands in the same danger, flies the same missions, and proves his ideas with his own life on the line. That is Charles Lindbergh's final legacy in the Second World War. Not just the Atlantic crossing, not just the fame, but the quiet fact that, for 6 weeks in 1944, in a corner of the Pacific where jungle met sea and cloud, he taught some of America's best fighter pilots to fly farther, fight longer, and live to see home again.